I'm really comfortable here. This is very nice. I didn't realize the speaker had it so comfortable. If I would have known this, I would have spoken more often.
I say that at the end of the year.
Yeah. You're so welcome, buddy.
Actually, so Johan Erasmus is known to us. Johan, thank you for driving through to Joburg for this, because what happened is we did a book launch of this thing. Them important people did a book launch of this thing in Pretoria. We never did one here. The trouble is now we don't. If you want the book after Johan's excellent talk, then you need to go to probably Good Neighbors here or Augustine's in Pretoria. You can't have mine because mine is signed by all sorts of important people. So coming to faith through Dawkins. Okay, so basically what this is, it's a collection of 12 stories from around the world of people. Well, Johan will tell the story of basically of people listening to Dawkins et al. And discovering, no, hang on, those, you know, those sort of, I don't know, arguments, or some of these things aren't even arguments, don't bear up very well. And it actually basically triggered or accelerated their search for something else. And so therefore coming to faith through Dawkins. And Johan is one of our esteemed and I was going to say extinguished, that's not the right word, distinguished contributors. Johan, I'm really comfortable here. I'm not sure if I'm letting go of the seat. Johan is married to Lorraine. They have 2 young boys. Johan has got degrees coming out of his ears. Johan, you got degrees in? I know one's theology, one's political science, and I forgot the third one. Philosophy. Okay, and there's a PhD in the woodworks, but it's a very deep wood. I'm trying to think what else to say. Johan leads a Dialogue Community Church in Pretoria. He also co-leads with Skalk, who's also here. Beata Einders, which is you can explain that a little bit as well. So Johan's a really awesome guy. Actually, in fact, that awesome that I'm going to vacate this awesome seat in order to allow him to speak. Johan, thank you so much for doing this and being here.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So before I get to the book, I'm going to do that near the end. I want to make a few, I want to sort of dive into, I think, the environment that gave rise to this book. So in 2001 we had 9/11, and I'm not sure, I'm pretty sure it's going to work here, but can you guys remember where you were when you saw the images or whatever? Now I many years ago I took a tour to America at Ground Zero, and I had I kid you not, 80 high school children that I was taking through America. And at Ground Zero, I asked them, and I'm pretty sure you guys can remember where you were when this happened. And I just had a blank expression. And it turns out none of them were born, which is so bizarre. That was such a reality check. Anyways, and it had geopolitical effects after 9/11, but it also had, I think, it was a bit of a watershed intellectual moment as well. And after 2001, you have the rise of the so-called new atheism. So you have the 4 horsemen of the new atheism. You've got Richard Dawkins, you've got Sam Harris, you've got Christopher Hitchens, and then the 4th guy is Daniel Dennett, who wasn't really that exciting or impressive, but they had to have 4, otherwise you can't have the 4 horsemen that can play with the apocalypse. So they added Daniel Dennett to the equation as well, and these guys became best-selling authors almost overnight and just dominated, I think, the public landscape. Dawkins became almost a household name. Sam Harris and his podcast became super famous, and this even had an effect here in South Africa. And what was really exciting is that I was going through university at this same time, so we were being exposed to this and having conversations about it, and it was really a lot of fun. And you had a South African version of this as well. So George Claassen, not sure if you guys are familiar with him. He was a journalist professor at Stellenbosch, and he's quite a famous atheist, but not as famous as his brother, who's the famous Springbok, Wynand Claassen. And and there's a story about Wynand Claassen in this book that's worth sharing maybe at the end. But anyway, so you've got George Claassen. I remember there was this guy who was quite vocal at the University of Cape Town, Jacques Rousseau. But during the same time, you've got Gareth Cliff expressing his atheism more on the airwaves. Eusebius Macaiser, I think he was more agnostic, and he was sometimes skeptical of the Four Horsemen or of Dawkins. But this just opened up this massive religious conversation in South Africa. And you also, for the first time, heard of sort of the Christian response to this. So all of a sudden you had the John Lennoxes, you had the William Lane Craigs and the late and tragic Ravi Zacharias, and many of these figures. And the debate was really alive. And I think one of the reasons why this conversation went viral is because it also happened around the same time that YouTube started appearing. And all of a sudden you had these clickbaity videos of Dawkins owns Christian, or John Lennox beast mode, or debunking a Christian, an atheist in 5 minutes. It's a very, very silly things, but that was good for the conversation, and everybody just got on the bandwagon, and both claimed victory, obviously, on YouTube. So that's just how it works. And then something odd started to happen. The new atheists, I'm thinking of Harris, I'm thinking of Dawkins, I'm thinking of Hitchens, they got into trouble all of a sudden. And they were so busy looking at their right, at the Christians and at the Muslims doing the fighting, that they never bothered to look on their left. And all of a sudden, you just heard these remarks that you guys the new atheism is very patriarchal. And these guys couldn't quite understand where that was coming from. And they said the new atheism is ridiculously Western centric and is absolutely against any other forms of knowledge. And it's actually imperialistic, the new atheism. And it is because now here's the other problem that you have. You've got these champions of it. You've got these champions of science, and everything is science, and that's the most important thing. Now, what happens alongside that? You've got the rise of the LGBTQIA plus movement, which, dare I say, is not very scientific, but they feel very strongly about their cause, and if you start to fight with them, you're going to get in hot water. So now you've got science, and all of a sudden these new atheists, these champions of science, are cowering away a little bit from this discussion, because you don't tell these people that what they believe is not aligned with science, is not aligned with reality. And the new activists did something that Christian apologists couldn't do for decades. They did in 5 years, and that is they got the atheists to shut up. So the new activists ended, to a certain extent, the new atheism. And the conversation between Christian and atheist, does God exist, and the existence of God, and the evidence for the resurrection, and problem of evil, or whatever, that conversation almost overnight changed completely into your so-called identity politics, identity struggles. And it's quite fascinating. And the new atheists didn't really do well. Dawkins all but disappeared. Today, he is almost extinct in the conversation. The only guy that sort of managed to transition is Sam Harris, because he started talking about politics the whole time, and Islamophobia and Islam, etc., etc., etc. So the conversation just shifted to race and gender and sexuality. And the question became not, is atheism true? But the question became, is atheism racist? The question is not, does God exist? The question is he a homophobe? So the questions just started to change completely in terms of asking, God's existence became less important than his politics. Okay, and that's how the conversation started to shift in this new political landscape. This is a time of Black Lives Matter, Me Too, Rhodes Must Fall, Afrikaans must fall, Occupy Wall Street, Love is Love, etc., etc. And the one thing that happened in this public conversation is it became very shrill. We've for the first time heard of cancel culture. We heard of offense archaeology. So whenever there's a public figure, then the mob would just go into their social media feeds, go as far back as possible, and just find something stupid that they said somewhere. And I mean, you are bound to say something stupid over a long stretch of time that's either sexist, racist, homophobic, or whatever. And then that person is cancelled. And the other thing that also started happening is it became very difficult for people to have a conversation. The atheists and the Christians actually had a conversation, and they struggled at some points because their epistemology differs. But there were certain facts that they were willing to agree on. But in the new activism, there was just nothing to agree on. If you come from a particular place of power and privilege, it is impossible for somebody else to understand you. We are on different it's not a level playing field. We're on different sides of the conversation, which leads to what they call incommensurability. It's impossible for us to understand each other. And I think our cultural moment now is we're sort of at the back end of that, becoming a little bit disillusioned with the identity politics mania, and we're at the back end of it. So where are we now? I'm sorry, I know I'm supposed to talk about the book.
No, you're doing well.
But
No, it's awesome.
But where we are now, something bizarre starting to happen, and that is we started to, yeah, maybe let me focus on one particular lady. They actually should have made it the 5 horsemen of the apocalypse, or they actually should have just dropped Daniel Dennett and included a public intellectual called Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Have you guys heard of her? She is from Somalia, Kenya, that part of the world, and then educated in the Netherlands, and is this very famous public intellectual, feminist scholar, and a very outspoken secularist, very outspoken against Islam and what it stands for, and very scared of what it would mean for Europe and North America. And she became this voice of atheism. Christopher Hitchens famously said that she's the most intelligent voice that's ever come out of Africa, which is kind of ironic, just because she agreed with Christopher Hitchens. She's now the most intelligent voice that could ever come out of Africa. But so Ayaan Hirsi Ali, I quite liked her. She's outspoken on a number of issues, but one of those things, very secular, very much in love with Enlightenment values and atheism. And then 3 weeks ago, I think it was 3 weeks ago, there was an article, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and it said, "Why I am now a Christian." It's on this Unheard. I'm not sure if you are familiar with Unheard, the website, but they've got pretty cool articles. Last night, I listened to this very, I mean, it's a much bigger, no offense, Thorsten, much bigger and fancier TGIF. And you've got these secularists, fancy pipe smoking intellectuals sitting there and interviewing her on her Christianity. And the one thing that she said in the article, but the interview that I watched last night, I can share the link, I think is even better. It gives you more of a glimpse. She said the reason why she came to faith was mostly civilizational. What she meant by that is she realized that this post-Christian society in which we live is to a certain extent unlivable. She said that we thought that people post-Christianity in the West will become less religious, but it's not true. They've become more religious. But now they don't have words like, or concepts like, forgiveness and reconciliation and grace to manage this ridiculous religiosity that they that they sit with. And she just says that it became very difficult for her to try and figure out why are we struggling. And then she realized, well, these things that we hold dear as liberals, this is her speaking now, things like freedom of speech, which is at a all-time low in the West, at least for the last 100 years or so. Things like tolerance, things like mutual respect, things like innate dignity, things like objective morality, things like introspection and repentance. She thought that these things can easily exist in a secular context, and she's now realizing it can't. It is, the secular context is but cut flowers from a Christian, Judeo-Christian tradition, and it is struggling to survive without being rooted in that world. And that is partly why, in her words, we find ourselves in this very illiberal place. Illiberal, in other words, geez, we're really struggling to have conversations that's not polarizing, that is dignified, that is respecting, etc., etc., etc. And Ayaan Hirsi Ali, I think, is one example of a number of people. Now, she's taken the plunge into Christianity, but the people who's articulated this Christian heritage of the West and why we are struggling more are mostly all atheist or agnostic, definitely not Christian. So the people to replace the Hitchens and the Dawkinses in the public intellectual arena, all of a sudden, Jordan Peterson. Everybody's talking about Jordan Peterson. Now make of him what you will. The point is, you know of him. And he's sort of replaced now the Dawkins and the Harrises, etc., etc. And Peterson, although he's not a Christian, he would say, look, this is the Christian seedbed that we are living in, and he's articulating it. You've got a British journalist. If I want to make a direct comparison between them and the New Horseman, I would say he's the new Christopher Hitchens. And that is a journalist called Douglas Murray, very combative, very sort of feisty, and also an atheist gay. And he says, the problem is we have lost our Christian heritage. We've lost our Christian tradition. And that's why we're struggling to make sense of reality. The West is just floating. And we realize that these values that we treasured cannot exist in a vacuum. They exist because of a Christian tradition. And then I think probably the best Christian apologetics book of the last 10 years was also written by an agnostic. And that is Tom Holland's Dominion, The Making of the Western Mind. Have any of you read them? I mean, don't say, no shame if you haven't. Have you not? Shame on you. Like, this is some people find it difficult, but I couldn't help but notice that Ayaan Hirsi Ali quoted from Dominion as well, that this is probably the most famous public historian at the moment is Tom Holland. And he wrote this book, and he just pretty much says everything that we hold dear in the Western world, and I've mentioned them before, comes from Christianity. And he traces those things, whether it is separation of church and space, church and state, whether it's whether it's tolerance, dignity, etc., etc. It comes from this Judeo-Christian worldview. Dignity, the poor, the marginal, etc., etc., etc. And I think these days the new atheism is more of a historical phenomenon. It's not really something that we engage with directly. It has changed completely. But this is just sort of a background, and forgive me for that, of what I at least think happened in the last couple of decades in the religious landscape and how the language changed. And I think a lot of apologists, and this is again very subjective, but a lot of apologists who are still just talking about evolution, did it happen, did it not happen, God's existence, Kalam, cosmological argument, moral argument, a theodicy, etc. These guys are sort of left without an opponent almost. They've got good arguments and they're ready to go, but the culture shifted and they almost have nobody to fight against. They're struggling to find that kind of atheist that wants to engage on that level. So this book comes at the back end of what I think I just described, the back end of this intellectual movements and changes. And in the book, you've got, I think, interesting stories. There's a lady called Sarah Stonebreaker. If this is not usable, it would seem. Sarah Stonebreaker. I might butcher the names of my fellow authors. I'm an author, by the way. Sorry, I've been milking that. I wrote like 1/14 of a book, and from now on, when I introduce myself, somebody asks me, "What do you do?" I'm an author, and I just start sentences with "as an author." I think, but so Sarah is the one, and she read science, I think, at Cambridge, and then when she did the history of science, she just bought this Enlightenment lie that you had the ancients and the ancient Greeks, and they were very scientific and philosophical. Then came the Dark Ages. You guys have all heard it, the Dark Ages of the church, and they were, just keeping a lid on and the original load shedding, exactly. And then came the light, the Enlightenment, and this is when Europe started to retrace, found their way back to the ancient Greeks and Romans and their philosophy and technology and science, etc. But that is just a lie. It is an Enlightenment lie that has been exposed in the last few years by Tom Holland and others over and over again. And here was a scientist who holds the scientific revolution and everything that's come from science so dearly. And she realized, oh my goodness, this really didn't exist in a vacuum. This is a product of this Christian worldview. And all her favorite scientists, she realized, were very, very committed Christians. So that sort of started her journey. What other people mentioned is they read Dawkins. I can't say that I read any of Dawkins's biology books. I can't say that I've read any biology books, as a matter of fact. But apparently, Richard Dawkins is a very talented writer of popular science and of biology. And you've got books like, I think it's The Blind Watchmaker, or I'm not even going to try and name them. But all of these authors almost read his books on biology, and they said it's second to none. It is beautifully written. It is very measured. It is very reasonable. It is brilliant. So when this guy says he's an atheist and they read the book, they picked up the book almost thinking, well, this is it. This must be the most foundational. If it is written anything like he wrote his textbooks on biology, then this must be amazing, and it must be sort of the nail in the coffin of God and Christianity at large. And then the tone of the book was just completely different. No evidence, just one rant after the next, very polemical, nothing of the reasonableness, nothing of the measuredness that they found in the early books. And this started asking, and this was the thing that got them to start asking questions about, is why is Dawkins all of a sudden like this? We loved him like this, but now he's like this. What is this Christianity thing? And then they were exposed to the Christian intellectual tradition, and many of them came to faith through that, being disillusioned with how their hero handled the issue of God, as opposed to how he handled the issue of biology. Does that make sense? And that sort of started them on their journey. You've got Louise Mabille. Now, Louise is this crazy intellectual giantess, and she found herself in my wife actually came to our church because Louise Mabille spoke there, and she said, my goodness, if this lady is a Christian and she's speaking at a church, and I want to be there, because she's this very cutthroat philosopher at UP back then. And she also had a massive disillusionment with atheism, and she relates it in her story as well. As for my story, I didn't want to be someone who's now this card-carrying, atheist comes to faith, 5-minute YouTube video, because it's really not the case. But the quick version of that is the quick version of that is that I grew up in a very Afrikaans environment where yeah, I basically played rugby and watched rugby and went to church on a Sunday, and I was religious about both. And then when my father died, I started asking some more existential questions. And I was a 10-year-old, 11-year-old asking about God's existence, asking about ultimate reality, etc. And I remember being in our primary school library, and I picked up a little green book, and it said, "Bestaan God regtig? Does God really exist?" And I took the book, and I remember there was a friend who was just walking past me, said, "Oh, what book do you have?" And he just grabbed it out of my hand, looked at it, and said, "How dare you? How dare you ask a question like that?" And I realized, oh, goodness me, I must really take this underground, which I did. And I found the Afrikaans environment, or the Afrikaner environment, a very lonely place to wrestle with questions. And eventually, when I took my questions to Potchefstroom and wherever, a couple of funny things happened. The one thing is I wanted to study theology, and you had what I call the church police back then in the Reformed Church. All of these old professors would sit there and they would ask and interrogate you, why do you want to study theology? And I was sitting there, I didn't really read the memo, and I just said, I want to know if it's true. And these Reformed professors were so uncomfortable, and eventually after 5 minutes one of them were able to say something, and the one just said, "Brother, you don't study theology because you want faith. You study theology because you have faith." I'm like, "Oh, okay." Well, and then we all agreed that I was in the wrong place, and then they sent me to the philosophy faculty because they will take anything that they can get. But even at an intellectual level, I mean, sort of at a tertiary level, I struggled to ask the questions, to find a safe space to ask the questions that I was wrestling with. And eventually, the church, at least the environment that I found myself in Potchefstroom, you basically had two warring Christian factions. The one group told me that if I was chosen, if I was part of the elect, everything will be okay. The other group told me if I can speak in tongues, everything will be okay. And between these two, there was just nothing attractive. And eventually, I found myself sort of dabbling with the new atheists, because at least it sounded to me like they were sure about themselves and they were answering the questions that I was asking in a way that the Christians around me were not answering those questions. And then one night it went horribly wrong for me. I used to take, and I mean I still do, like to annoy people by asking them questions that they might not be comfortable with, and especially on the Christian level, you know, what about this? What about that? What about that? Sort of devil's advocate. And at that stage, I was maybe more of a devil than just the advocate. And I saw this friend of mine for the first time in a while, and she was back from the States. She was studying philosophy and theology there. And I said, "You're studying philosophy. Do you know the Dawkins, Harrises of the world? Have you engaged with them a little bit?" And usually nobody responded to that. And then I would sort of articulate some of the arguments that I think they have against Christianity, and see how these people struggle with it, and maybe just reduce it again to, well, if you're chosen, or if you can speak in tongues, everything is going to be okay. And this friend of mine, she was an older friend, she sighed. She's like, "Oh, Johan." And I'm like, "Oh, this is interesting." She said, "If you're going to be an atheist, at least do it because you listen to proper atheists. But if you give it away to these guys, then you don't have any self-respect." And at that stage, there was this new young earth creationist, Kent Hovind. I'm not sure if you guys interacted with him a little bit. And at this stage, she said, like, if you're an atheist and you get converted by Kent Hovind, I mean, I'm not against it, but have some self-respect. And I was taken aback. I'm like, "Oh, this is interesting." And I said, "Okay, well, who are some of the better atheists?" And then she started telling me who she thinks are some of the better atheists that I should be reading. So here was a Christian converting me to better atheism. And she said, "You know what, read a bit of Thomas Nagel over here, read a bit of Michael Roos, read a bit of Thomas Nagel." And I eventually sort of, man, I think she's just bluffing. So I said, okay. And I articulated the best way that I could formulate the problem of evil back then. And she said, I think we can formulate that even stronger. And she starts to reformulate the problem of evil in a way that sounded more airtight. I said, yeah, that one. Answered that one, the one that you just articulated. And then she just started to say, you see, well, Thomas Aquinas said this, and this is what you have to understand about this theodicy, etc., etc. Now, I didn't understand most of what she said, but I was just amazed that here was a lady, a seminarian, who wasn't flustered at all. As a matter of fact, she welcomed it, and she didn't shame my skepticism. She shamed my superficial skepticism, but not my skepticism back then. And we had a conversation, and I vividly remember that it was 4 a.m. in the morning, and I would still wake her up and check. I've got one more question, but she was falling asleep halfway through her answers and whatnot. And that really set me on this path. Now, was I an atheist? I'm not sure. I was an atheist on Mondays. On Sundays, it was a cheap date to take a girl to church. So on Sundays, I was less of an atheist. As a matter of fact, to this day, I'm mostly an atheist before 9 in the morning. And so it's not like it's this clean cut, I was this hardcore skeptic and then I became this hardcore Christian. I was a bit of a mix back then, and I'm still of a mix now, by the way, in the sense that I sometimes I believe more than other times. There's something emotional about my faith now, in the same way there was something emotional and fluctuating about my skepticism back then. And I can't say that there was this one moment, but this really set me on a course of discovering, I think, first of all, the Christian intellectual tradition, which was my gateway drug. But if you ask me today, do I believe because I was convinced by the Kalam cosmological argument? I would say I was convinced, and it really helped me, but I'm not sure that is the reason why I'm staying there. Is it the moral argument? It is powerful. I really like it. I don't think that's the reason I'm staying. Is it N.T. Wright's defense of the resurrection of Jesus? It is profound, and it definitely plays a role, but it's not that. Is it maybe listening to Mumford and Sons? Yeah, but it's not just that. Is it listening to Bob Dylan? Absolutely, but not just listening to that. Is it sitting in the Sagrada Familia of Antonio Gaudi and just marveling at who was called God's architect, and just this thing that he created that is just so beautiful and speaks to my soul? Yes, it's that, but it's not quite that. Is it the fact that in South Africa, I see that faith really does make a difference, especially in a township or an impoverished environment where people have hope and meaning and dignity, and they find it in their faith. You can't tell me that faith and Christianity doesn't make a difference, because when I'm in those spaces, I can see the difference it makes. Just was it 2 weeks ago, we had a conference of these very inspiring South Africans in agriculture, in social development, in business, in church, in various spaces. And these are people doing amazing things in South Africa. And what is their primary motivation? It felt like a Billy Graham rally as they were speaking. It was supposed to be a secular event. And they just went on. Jesus told me this, then God said this. And I was cringing at one stage. Just tone it down a little bit. But the point is that faith plays such an instrumental role in people staying in South Africa and them caring and making a difference, etc. It's all of these things and none of them. It's also to be invited in the world of Scripture and just seeing the beauty and the harmony and the meta themes and how everything just connects. And preachers like Tim Keller or Tim Mackey. Tims are usually good preachers, it would seem. These guys just really help me to understand N.T. Wright as well. Some of these wonderful themes and stories through Scripture. So it's all of these things and none of them. And I think one of the last things that really pushed me into the arms of Jesus is if the last few years is anything to go by, what a society will look like in a thoroughly post-Christian world, then I really want, with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, say, one of the reasons why I'm a Christian is because of the civilizational reasons. There is something profoundly more attractive about the Christian option than about the non-Christian argument option, at least at how it's playing out on a societal level. I'm going to stop there.